Would you like to support my work? Subscribe to my channel and help me reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. My first night in the psychiatric clinic was oppressive and eerie. The building itself had a gloomy atmosphere, as if it had stored years of pain and despair within its walls. I couldn't immediately name it, but from the moment I entered my room, I knew something was wrong here. The room was simply furnished. A basic bed, an old wardrobe, and a window overlooking the inner courtyard. Despite the apparent normalcy, there was a strange heaviness in the air, as if darkness was watching me. I couldn't relax, feeling the coldness literally settling into my bones. It wasn't long before the first strange noises began. At first, I thought they were the normal sounds of an old building, the creaking of pipes, or the sighing of the wooden floor. But soon I heard footsteps moving slowly and persistently through the hallway. The steps sounded strangely muffled, as if someone was sneaking barefoot across the floor. I held my breath and listened. Suddenly, the steps stopped directly in front of my door. My heart pounded, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing on the other side of the door, listening to me. A knot formed in my stomach, but I didn't dare to look. Instead, I lay still in bed, unable to move. When the steps finally continued after an agonizing silence, I let out the breath I had unconsciously held, but the tension remained. I didn't sleep that night because I knew that something in this hospital was waiting for me. The next morning, I decided to explore the clinic. The hallways were long, dark, and seemed endless. There were few windows, and the light from the ceiling lamps was dim and occasionally flickered, which further intensified the gloomy impression. The clinic felt deserted, as if it hadn't been used for years. I noticed that not all hallways were the same. A particular hallway was especially eerie. It was longer than the others, and the air there was colder. At the end of this hallway was room 23. The door was locked, and an old sign warned against entering the room. No entry for patients. But it was precisely this prohibition that made me curious. Every time I passed room 23, I felt a strange tension. It was as if something was waiting for me behind that door. The area around the room seemed darker, and even the clinic staff avoided coming near this room. When I asked someone about the room, I received no clear answer. Once, I tried to ask one of the nurses what was going on with room 23, but she evaded my question. She looked around nervously and finally said it was just a storage room, but her trembling voice and quick departure revealed that there was more to it. Her reaction only made my curiosity grow further. The rest of the clinic seemed almost deserted. The few patients I saw were withdrawn, and no one seemed to know or want to know what was happening in room 23. But I couldn't shake the thought that this room played a key role in the strange events I was experiencing here. On the second night, the strange noises began again, but this time they were different. It wasn't just footsteps or the creaking of the old building. I heard whispers, soft, incomprehensible murmuring that seemed to come from the walls. At first, it was just a faint rustling, but then it became clearer. The whispering sounded as if several voices were speaking at once, but I couldn't make out any words. It was as if the voices came from another world, trapped within the hospital walls. The longer I listened, the more unsettling it became. I felt they wanted something from me, but I didn't understand what. I sat up and looked around. But the room was empty. Still, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to attract my attention. My heart began to beat faster, and I felt fear rising within me. It was as if the hospital itself had come alive and was trying to communicate with me. Suddenly, I heard the voices whisper my name. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and my whole body stiffened. It was as if someone was calling my name right next to my ear. Yet no one was there. The whispers stopped abruptly, but the feeling that I wasn't alone remained. I tried to ignore the voices, but I couldn't stop thinking about them. What did they want from me, and why did I only hear them at night? I knew this was just the beginning. The clinic was trying to tell me something deeply hidden within its walls. On the third night, the feeling of threat grew stronger as I lay in bed. Trying to forget the strange events of the past few days, I suddenly felt the air in the room become heavier. It was as if the darkness around me grew thicker, as if it were alive. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow slowly moving across the floor without any discernible source. At first, I thought it was an optical illusion, but then the shadow took shape. A dark, human figure stood at the foot of my bed. My heart raced, and I could barely move. The figure was silent, yet its mere presence radiated an unbearable threat. I couldn't make out any facial features, only the outline of a person staring at me. It was as if darkness itself had taken shape and was watching me. Suddenly, the figure began to move. It glided silently through the room, coming ever closer to my bed. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to stir, but I was paralyzed. Just as I thought it would reach me, it dissolved into the darkness and vanished. All that remained was the feeling that it would soon return. I spent the rest of the night awake, unable to close my eyes. What I had seen was real, I knew that. The shadows in this hospital were more than just shadows. They were alive, and they were watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, I decided to talk to one of the nurses about what I had seen. Perhaps she could explain what was happening in this hospital. However, as I began to talk about the shadows and the whispers, she turned pale and evaded my question. She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "You must not trust the shadows," she whispered, looking around nervously, "and by all means stay away from room 23. Her words sounded like an urgent warning, as if she knew what lurked there. But before I could ask further, she hurried away, as if afraid she had said too much. Her reaction gave me no peace. Why shouldn't I trust the shadows, and what exactly was hidden behind the locked door of room 23? The questions piled up in my head, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt that I had to face the truth, no matter how frightening it was. Despite the fear that rose within me, my curiosity also grew. The shadows, the whispers, the strange atmosphere in the clinic, it all seemed connected to room 23, but I knew I had to be careful. It was obvious that something dark lurked in the clinic, and it would not easily allow me to discover it. The nurse's warning echoed in my head, but I knew I had to face the secret of this room. There were too many unanswered questions, and I was determined to find out what was really going on, even if it was dangerous. The nurse's warning didn't let go of me, but my curiosity was stronger. I knew I had to find out what was happening in the room, even if it was dangerous. On the fourth night, I crept through the clinic while everyone slept. The hallway was enveloped in deep darkness, and the silence was almost palpable. The closer I got to room 23, the stronger the feeling of dread became. The air was cool, and my hands began to tremble slightly as I touched the doorknob. To my surprise, the door was unlocked. Slowly, it opened with a soft creak, as if inviting me to enter. The room was dark, and the few shadows I could make out appeared distorted. My heart pounded, but I had to know what was going on here. With hesitant steps, I entered the room and immediately felt an invisible presence. It was as if the room itself was alive and expecting me. Suddenly, I felt a movement behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. But the air had changed. It had grown colder, heavier. I wanted to flee, but something held me in place. A cold hand rested on my shoulder, and a shiver ran through my body. I ran out of the room, my heart pounding madly. The door slammed shut behind me, and I could hardly believe what I had just experienced. Something in room 23 had touched me, and I knew it wouldn't forget me so easily. Whatever lurked there was now aware of me. The touch I had felt in room 23 wouldn't leave me alone. In the days that followed, the coldness I had experienced there seemed to haunt me. No matter where I was in the clinic, that icy presence stayed with me. It never let me forget what had waited for me in that room. I tried to focus on my daily routine, but it was impossible. The shadows I had only seen in my room before now appeared everywhere. It was as if the darkness had conspired against me, wanting to engulf me. I began to doubt my sanity, but the coldness that surrounded me was real. No matter where I went, it felt as if someone or something was watching me. The footsteps in the hallway, the voices in the walls, all of it intensified. There was no safe place left in the clinic. Even in broad daylight, the presence was palpable. It was as if the darkness had come alive within me and was slowly consuming me. One night, the cold became so intense that I lay trembling in my bed. It was as if the temperature in my room had dropped below 0. I could see my own breath as I tried to calm myself, but no matter how much I wrapped myself in the blankets, the cold remained. It was as if the clinic itself wanted to extinguish me. I began to realize that the darkness was not just trapped in room 23, it had touched me, and now I was part of it. I was sure there was no turning back. Whatever had begun in that room would not let go of me until it had completely consumed me. Desperate to find a solution, I began to search through the clinic's old files. Perhaps there were clues about what was really going on here. The clinic was old, and I was sure I wasn't the first person to experience these inexplicable things. Somewhere there had to be a trace of the truth. After hours of searching, I stumbled upon a series of reports that spoke of strange incidents in the clinic. Patients had reported similar apparitions, shadow figures, cold touches, whispers in the night. Some of the patients were classified as untreatable and later transferred or disappeared without a trace. One report particularly stood out. It was the records of a patient who claimed to have been haunted by a dark presence in his room. He spoke of a ritual that had been performed in the clinic decades ago. This ritual was supposedly meant to break the boundary between life and death and conjure something dark. The report also mentioned that the patient had been housed in room 23. It seemed that this room had a special significance, not just for me, but for many who had been in this clinic before me. The clinic had tried to cover up the incidents, but the records were proof that something unnatural was happening here. With each report I read, it became clear to me that I had stumbled into something bigger than I had initially thought. Room 23 was not just a room. It was a gateway to something much worse. And the worst part was that I had unknowingly opened the gate. The discovery of the ritual mentioned in the old files wouldn't let me go. I began to think about what was really going on in the room. The ritual was supposedly meant to connect the spirit world with the real world, but something had obviously gone wrong. Something dark had been unleashed by the ritual. I continued my research and finally found the exact descriptions of the ritual. It was supposedly meant to help establish contact with the dead, but there were strict warnings about what could happen if the ritual was performed incorrectly. The warnings were clear. If you opened the gate without taking the proper protective measures, something unknown would be released. The ritual had taken place in room 23, and since then, this room had been cursed. The report spoke of recurring incidents in which patients and staff became victims of the darkness. The clinic management had tried to keep everything under wraps, but the truth could not be hidden so easily. The more I read, the more I realized that I had unknowingly become part of this ritual. By entering the room, I had activated whatever lurked there, and now it wanted more. It wanted me. I knew I had to reverse the ritual, but I had no idea how. The files offered no solution, only warnings. And every additional night I spent in the clinic brought me closer to the abyss. During my investigations, I came across the case of a particularly disturbing patient. It concerned a man who had been treated in the clinic some years ago. He had been admitted to room 23 after similar incidents to mine and had described the same apparitions, shadows, voices, and the inexplicable cold. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and soon after, he disappeared without a trace. According to the reports, he had simply vanished from his room one night. The official explanation was that he had escaped, but there was no indication of how he could have done that. All that remained of him was his medical file, and it spoke of the same horrors that now haunted me. I asked some of the nurses about him, but no one wanted to talk about him. It was as if he had never existed. The hospital had erased him, just like many others. But I was sure he hadn't just disappeared. Room 23 had taken him, just as it was now trying to take me. The realization hit me with full force. Room 23 was more than just a room. It was a nexus, a place where the boundary between this world and the other was thin. Anyone who entered it risked being devoured by the darkness, and the vanished patient was not the first to succumb to this fate. With each passing day, I felt myself being drawn deeper into the darkness. The shadows were now a constant companion, and I knew my end was near if I didn't act quickly. The nights became unbearable. Every night, the darkness seemed to grow more alive, the shadows stronger. They were no longer just fleeting apparitions, but something tangible that wrapped around me and enveloped me. It was as if the clinic itself was a part of this shadow, slowly awakening. I began to drift to the brink of madness. Sleep had become alien to me, and every minute I spent awake felt as if I was staring into a deep abyss. The corridors of the clinic seemed like a labyrinth, and sometimes I felt as if I would never leave them again. Room 23 was the center of this labyrinth, and the shadow within had begun to reach for me. One night, I saw the figure again. This time, it stood directly beside my bed. It was no longer a phantom shadow, but a complete darkness that seemed to absorb all light into itself. Its eyes, if it had any, bored into my soul, and I felt it trying to pull me towards it. I tried to scream, but no sound came from my lips. The shadow did not move, yet its mere presence sent me into a panic. I knew I could not resist much longer. Soon, it would take me, just as it had taken all the others. I knew that the ritual had awakened something within me that I could no longer ignore. The darkness wanted me, and I knew it was only a matter of time until I fully succumbed to it. On the last day, as I walked through the clinic, I felt that something had definitively changed. The walls seemed to move, the shadows were everywhere. They flowed across the floor like a wave of darkness, consuming everything around them. There was no place left where I felt safe. The staff seemed barely aware of my presence. It was as if I had already become part of the darkness, as if I were invisible. But the shadows saw me, they watched me, and I could feel them drawing me ever closer to them. On the last night, I decided to confront the darkness. I went back to room 23. The door was open, as if it had been waiting for me. The coldness flowing from within was more intense than ever before. Every step into this room felt as if I was being pulled deeper into the abyss. As I entered the room, I knew there was no turning back. The darkness was everywhere. It engulfed me, and I could feel the shadow's breath on my skin. The whispers I had heard since my first night grew louder, and I finally understood what they were saying. You belong to us. I had opened the gate, and now the darkness would consume me. It was inevitable. Room 23 was not just a room. It was the heart of the shadow, and I was its next victim. My end had come. When I first entered the psychiatric clinic, I immediately felt that something was wrong. The building was old, with cracks in the walls and a pungent smell of disinfectant mixed with the musty aroma of damp wood, making it difficult to breathe. Every sound echoed through the empty hallways as if the building itself was breathing. The lights flickered occasionally, as if they were about to go out, leaving shadows that lingered longer than they should. It was as if the darkness of this place had an existence of its own. I could feel it slowly enveloping me, like an invisible shroud tightening around me. But I told myself it was just nervousness, nothing more. My room was in a secluded wing that seemed to be less frequently used. The furniture was simple and old-fashioned. A bed, a chair, and a wardrobe that let out an eerie creak when opened. Through the small, barred window, I could see the neglected garden, enclosed by high, moldy walls. It felt as if I was in another world, far from reality. With the darkness of night came discomfort. I couldn't find sleep as the wind howled outside and the building's walls groaned. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard a faint scratching, a sound that seemed to come from afar but steadily drew closer. I told myself it was the wind whistling through the old window frames, but the feeling of tension wouldn't leave me. In the morning, it was as if the clinic was bathed in a diffused light. The day began, but the cold I had felt during the night stayed with me. I knew this place harbored secrets, but I had no idea how deep those secrets would reach. Not yet. A day later, as I explored the clinic, I stumbled upon something strange. At the end of a long, dimly lit corridor, I discovered a small door that didn't match the others. It was narrow and low, almost as if it had been made for a child. It was peculiar to find such a room in a psychiatric clinic, especially in a wing that seemed so deserted. With hesitant steps, I approached the door and carefully opened it. Behind it was a tiny room, barely large enough for more than a bed and a few toys. The walls were painted with old, faded pictures showing children playing happily, but the room itself seemed like a relic, forgotten and enveloped in a strange silence. On the floor lay a few old toys, a worn teddy bear, a broken dollhouse, and some building blocks scattered as if by chance. It was as if someone had left the room in a hurry and never returned. But although everything was covered with a thin layer of dust, I had the unsettling feeling that this room was not truly empty. The atmosphere was suffocating, the air was cold, and the toys seemed to be waiting to be played with again. I couldn't explain why a children's room existed in a psychiatric clinic, especially in a state that seemed so strangely frozen, as if time flowed differently here. It was disturbing. When I left the room, I asked one of the nurses about it. Her reaction surprised me. She blinked nervously and immediately changed the subject. It was clear she didn't want to talk about it, but her reaction only piqued my curiosity further. Whatever had happened in that room, it had a significance that no one wanted to reveal. On the following night, I heard it for the first time, a faint giggle echoing through the silent corridors of the clinic. At first, I thought it was a patient who couldn't calm down in the night, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was the laughter of a child, a soft, almost cheerful giggle that nevertheless had something deeply unsettling about it. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding faster. The laughter sounded distant, yet it had something unnatural about it, as if it came from a place not entirely of this world. I listened, and the laughter became clearer, closer, almost as if the child was running through the hallways, playfully but invisibly. Despite the growing fear within me, I got up and carefully opened the door. The hallway was dark, only dimly lit by the flickering lights. The laughter now seemed to come from the direction of the abandoned children's room. I felt my breath quicken as I followed the sound that sent a chill down my spine. When I stood in front of the small door, the laughter abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound itself. I opened the door a crack and peered inside. The room was as I had left it, empty and quiet, yet the atmosphere was heavy, as if the air itself still carried the laughter. I felt watched, but no one was there. I quickly retreated, closed the door, and hurried back to my room. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound, whether a creak or a gust of wind, made me jump. The laughter, the innocent giggle of a child, was now in my head, and it wouldn't let me go. It was as if something in that room was waiting to be discovered. The following nights grew worse. It didn't just start with the laughter. I now also heard a scratching, a faint, incessant sound that slowly grated on my nerves. It began gently, barely audible, as if someone was lightly stroking the wall with their fingernails, but it grew steadily louder and more insistent. I lay awake, my heart racing, as the scratching came ever closer. It sounded as if it was coming directly from the wall next to my bed, as if something or someone was on the other side, unable to get out. My hand trembled as I placed it against the wall, but it felt normal. Still, the sound didn't stop, as if it came from the depths of the walls themselves. The scratching accompanied me all night. Sometimes it grew louder, then softer again, but it never completely disappeared. The unease within me grew, and I couldn't shake the thought that something was trapped in that room or behind those walls, something that was trying to get out, but in a way I couldn't understand. I spoke to the nurses again, but they evaded my questions. "There's nothing to fear," one of them said with a false smile, but her eyes betrayed a deeper fear. I felt that she knew more, but was too scared to speak it. Something in this clinic was wrong, and it was beginning to draw me deeper and deeper into its grasp. The nights dragged on, and the scratching became a constant companion. It was as if the sound wanted to call me, as if it wanted me to follow the sound, to trace it to its source. But my fear held me back. I knew I wasn't ready to face the truth yet. The next morning, I decided to enter the children's room again. I had to know what was going on there. As I opened the door, I was immediately struck again by that unnatural coldness. The room felt even emptier than last time, almost as if it had deteriorated further since my last visit. The toys still lay on the floor, but they now seemed even eerier. My gaze fell on the old teddy bear in the corner. It sat there as if watching me, its button eyes almost alive, and for a moment, I had the strange feeling that it knew something, that it had been a witness to something horrific. Hesitantly, I picked up the bear. It was worn, with a torn ear and stains on its fur. At that moment, the atmosphere in the room changed drastically. The temperature dropped, and I could see my own breath. Suddenly, I heard the laughter again, this time louder, more intense, as if it were right next to me. It came from the bed, but when I looked, no one was there. My hands trembled, and I dropped the bear. The laughter stopped immediately. I breathed a sigh of relief, and then noticed something on the wall that I hadn't seen before. An old picture, half covered in dust and dirt, showed a group of children. They stood in front of the children's room and smiled, but their eyes were empty, almost like dolls' eyes. Behind them in the shadow, I could make out a figure, a dark, menacing shape watching them. A shiver ran down my spine, and I left the room as quickly as I could. Whatever this picture depicted, it was clear that the shadow had a meaning I did not yet understand. But one thing I knew for sure: the children's room was the key to a terrible secret. In the following days, I tried to find out more about the children's room. I spoke to some of the older patients, hoping they knew something, but most of them were too disturbed to answer me. It was as if the mere mention of the room triggered a kind of fear in them that they couldn't put into words. Finally, I found an old woman who was willing to talk to me. She sat in a wheelchair and rarely spoke to others, but when I mentioned the children's room, she suddenly seemed to awaken. Her eyes widened, and her voice was barely more than a whisper. The child, it never left the hospital. I asked her what she meant, but she seemed lost in her thoughts. Gradually, she told me about a child who had lived in the clinic many years ago. It had disappeared one day, and no one had ever seen it again. Some said it had died, others claimed it had simply run away, but the woman was sure that the child was still there. "It sometimes laughs," she said with a trembling voice. "In the night, it wants to play, but no one answers it." I asked what had happened to the child, but the old woman refused to speak further. She just shook her head and looked at me with sad eyes, as if she knew the truth but was too afraid to speak it. This story gave me no peace. Was the child whose laughter I had heard really still here, or was it just an echo from the past that resonated through the corridors of the clinic? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I knew I would soon find the answer. After talking to the old woman, I started having strange dreams. On the first night, I dreamt that I was wandering through the dark corridors of the clinic, alone, accompanied by a feeling of loss and fear. The corridors were endless, and every time I turned a corner, I found myself in front of the children's room again. In my dream, the room's door was wide open. Inside, a little girl sat on the bed, her blonde curls falling over her face. She held a doll in her arms and swayed back and forth, humming softly to herself. When she lifted her head, I saw that her eyes were dark and empty, as if she couldn't see anything. I wanted to talk to her, wanted to tell her she wasn't alone. But as I tried to approach her, she suddenly vanished, as if she had dissolved into thin air. All that remained was the doll, lying on the bed, as if it had been waiting for me. The child's laughter echoed in my ears again as I woke up, drenched in sweat and with a pounding heart. These dreams recurred in the following nights. Each time, the dream led me back to the children's room, and each time I saw the girl looking at me with her empty eyes. It was as if she wanted something from me, as if she was waiting for an answer, but I didn't know what I could give her. With each dream, I felt the darkness within me grow. The clinic, the children's room, and the girl now haunted me not only during the day, but also in my dreams. It was as if the child was calling to me, but I couldn't understand the call. The boundaries between dream and reality began to blur. One morning, after dreaming about the girl again, I went back to the children's room. But this time something was different. The toys that had previously been scattered on the floor were gone. The room was emptier, as if someone had cleaned it up, yet I knew no one but me had been there. The teddy bear that had sat so eerily in the corner was also gone. It was as if the objects in this room had simply dissolved. My first thought was that someone had searched the room, but when I scoured the floor, I found no traces of activity. It was as if the toys had never existed. The walls of the room now had strange scratch marks. It looked as if someone had scratched them with small fingernails in a desperate attempt to hold onto something. The marks were fresh, and I couldn't explain how they got there. A feeling of dread overcame me. I tried to ask the staff, but no one wanted to talk about it. It was as if the toys had never been there. Some of the nurses gave me worried glances, as if they thought I was losing my mind, but I knew what I had seen. The toys had been real. The disappearance of the toys made it clear to me that something was happening in this room that I didn't understand. It was as if the child had lost its connection to this place, as if it was looking for something, and I began to suspect that it had found me. A few days later, I discovered something new in the children's room. In the corner, half hidden by an old curtain, stood a mirror. It was large and had a heavy, ornate frame that had gathered dust. I was sure this mirror hadn't been there before. It seemed to have appeared suddenly, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. I stepped closer and wiped away the dust. In the mirror, I saw my own face, tired and exhausted from the sleepless nights. But as I looked closer, I noticed a movement behind me. It was the girl. She stood in the corner of the room, exactly where I had found the teddy bear. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. I froze, my heart racing. And I hastily turned around, but no one was there. The room was empty. When I looked back into the mirror, the girl was also gone, but the feeling of her presence remained. It was as if the mirror was a kind of gateway, a connection between my world and hers. In the following days, I avoided the mirror, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I thought about the children's room, I felt the mirror calling to me. It was as if it held an answer to all my questions. But I didn't know if I was ready to find those answers. I started sleeping even worse at night. The girl now haunted me even when I was awake, her empty smile, the giggle driving me to madness. The mirror was the only clue I had, but I knew I had to be careful, for the mirror seemed to know more than I did. During one of my next visits to the children's room, I discovered an old diary hidden under the bed. It was tattered, its pages yellowed and crumpled at the edges, as if someone had hastily left it there. I carefully opened it and began to read. The first pages were written in a childlike hand. The diary apparently belonged to the girl I had repeatedly seen in my dreams. She wrote about her games with imaginary friends and about her dreams. But the further I read, the darker the entries became. The girl began to write about a dark figure she called the Shadow Man. He came to her every night, stood at the foot of her bed, and watched her. She wrote that she was afraid of him but found no one who believed her. He did not speak, but she felt his coldness and his eyes that pierced through her. The last entry in the diary was particularly disturbing. The girl wrote that the shadow man would take her. She did not know where he wanted to take her, but she was sure she would never return. The entry ended abruptly, as if she had been interrupted in the middle of writing. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I put the diary back, but the words wouldn't leave me alone. Was it possible that the shadow man was still in this room, that he had taken the child? The thought was unbearable, yet it fit the strange things I had experienced in the clinic. It was clear that I had to confront this shadow man if I wanted to learn the truth. The night after finding the diary, I couldn't sleep. The girl's words kept repeating in my head. The shadow man, who or what was he? What did he want from the girl? And why did I still feel his presence in this room? As I lay awake in bed, I heard the child's laughter again, but this time it was different. It was desperate, almost like a cry for help. It echoed through the dark corridors of the clinic and seemed to call to me. I knew I had to follow that call, even if fear paralyzed me. I got up, hastily threw something on, and walked through the gloomy hallways. The laughter led me to the children's room, where the door was already slightly ajar. A cold wind blew towards me, even though no windows were open. The atmosphere in the room was different from before, denser and more threatening. The girl stood in the middle of the room, exactly where I had seen her in my dreams. She clutched her doll tightly and looked at me with sad eyes. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I felt that she wanted to tell me something, but before I could react, I heard a soft but ominous whisper behind me. I slowly turned around, and there he stood, the shadow man. He was taller than I had imagined, a dark, menacing figure that seemed to consist of darkness itself. The cold emanating from him was overwhelming. My heart raced, and I felt my legs trembling. This was the moment I had always feared. The shadow man slowly approached me. Each step he took seemed to make the darkness in the room grow thicker around him. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. It was as if he had sucked the air out of my lungs. My body was paralyzed with fear, and I knew I couldn't escape this being. The girl was still standing there, her eyes now fixed on the shadow man, and I saw something in her gaze that I hadn't noticed before, a kind of determination, as if she knew what was about to happen. At that moment, time seemed to stand still. The shadow man was now directly in front of me, and I felt his icy presence. But suddenly, the girl moved. She took a step forward, directly towards the shadow man. Her hand lifted, and at that moment, the shadow man began to recoil. It was as if her presence weakened him, as if she had the power to drive him away. A soft hiss came from the darkness, and I felt the cold gradually recede. The shadow man slowly dissolved, disappearing into the darkness from which he had come. The girl looked at me one last time, and I recognized in her eyes an expression of peace that I had never seen before. Then she too vanished, dissolving into a warm, gentle light that brightened the room. I remained alone, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The darkness that had dominated the room for so long was gone, and with it, the threat of the shadow man. But I knew that this place would forever be connected to the girl. She might be free, but the children's room would always be a part of her. The next morning, I decided to leave the clinic. I knew I had narrowly escaped madness, but the child's laughter would always haunt me, a faint echo of the strange and unsettling events I had experienced in this eerie clinic. My first night shift at the old psychiatric clinic was anything but quiet. The building I was to work in was large and eerie, with long corridors that seemed endless. The walls were yellowed and the plaster was crumbling. The smell of disinfectant mingled with a foul odor that seemed to emanate from the damp walls. There were no modern facilities, the weak flickering of the neon lamps, the soft hum of the lighting, and the occasional creaking of the wooden floor only intensified the gloomy atmosphere. Although the building was officially still in operation, it felt deserted. The thought of how many people had lived and suffered here constantly haunted me. The nursing staff who handed over the shift to me seemed dismissive and tired. They spoke little and avoided eye contact. One of the nurses, Mrs. Schulz, casually pointed to the night nurse's room, a break room at the end of the corridor. "Don't go in there if the door is open," she said quietly, but with an urgency that made me pause. I couldn't quite understand her warning. It was a break room. What could possibly happen there? But her words wouldn't leave me alone. That night, as I walked through the empty corridors, this warning kept coming back to me. It was as if the clinic itself was trying to tell me something. The atmosphere became more oppressive the longer I was there. The darkness seemed heavier. The sounds louder. Every step I took echoed in the long hallways, as if someone was following me, but no one was there. The clinic felt like a living organism that sensed my presence. During my rounds, my path eventually led me to the night nurse's room. It was an unassuming room, barely larger than a storage closet, used as a break room for the staff. The door was locked, and a small sign indicated that the room was for staff only. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual about it, but I immediately felt an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach. The room was sparsely furnished. A worn chair, a small table, and a yellowed painting on the wall. The painting showed a nurse in old-fashioned clothing. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. It felt as if the room was watching me, as if it were alive. I sat on the chair to take a short break, but the cold in the room made me restless. The air was noticeably cooler than in the rest of the building, and it felt as if an invisible pressure was weighing down on me. Every small sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After a few minutes, I decided to leave the room. As I opened the door, a wave of uneasiness suddenly overcame me. The hallway, which had previously seemed normal, appeared to have changed. The shadows were deep, and the sounds of the clinic had transformed into a strange hum. A quick glance back showed me that the night nurse's room door was now ajar, even though I had closed it. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Mrs. Schulz's warning flashed through my mind again. "Don't go in there if the door is open." I hastily closed the door and decided to give the room a wide berth for the rest of the night. In the nights that followed, I noticed more and more strange sounds in the clinic. These were not the typical noises of an old building, like the creaking of wood or the faint hum of the lighting. They were slow, steady footsteps that moved towards me, only to then fade into nothing. Sometimes I heard a gentle scratching, as if someone was lightly tracing the walls with their fingernails. The sound was soft, but it seemed to come from the walls themselves. The footsteps and the scratching often followed me, especially when I was near the night nurse's room. It was as if the room was calling to me, but I resisted the urge to open the door. One night, as I walked past the door, I heard a distinct knocking from inside. It wasn't a loud knock, but a soft, almost hesitant tapping, as if someone was gently requesting entry. My heart raced, and I stood rooted to the spot. The knocking stopped abruptly, but the coldness that seemed to come from the room remained. I approached the door and carefully placed my ear against it. A whisper, soft and incomprehensible, emanated from inside the room, a woman's voice, but the words were unintelligible. My hand trembled as I grasped the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. The nurse's warning came back to me. Whatever was in that room, it wanted to get out, but I knew it was not a good idea to free it. I pulled back and left the door closed. One night, I was accompanied by a colleague, Anke Mueller, an experienced nurse who had been working in the clinic for years. We checked the corridors together, and although she didn't say much, it was reassuring to have someone with me. However, something about her seemed tense, as if she knew more than she let on. Around midnight, we briefly separated to check different areas of the clinic. Ank wanted to get some medication from the storage room, but when I looked for her, she had disappeared without a trace. I called her name several times, but there was no answer. Her radio lay unused on a chair, and her flashlight flickered faintly on the floor. A wave of panic swept over me as I realized she hadn't just left. The corridor where she was last seen led directly past the night nurse's room. I ran through the hallways, searching every corner, but Ank remained gone. It was as if she had dissolved into thin air. My gaze inevitably wandered to the night nurse's room door. It was ajar again. Although I was sure I had closed it, I felt a deep unease in the pit of my stomach. Had Ank gone in? Had she ignored the warning, or had something in that room pulled her in? The thought that she might be trapped in that room was unbearable. Yet when I pressed the doorknob, the door remained firmly locked. Ank was gone, and I had no idea where she was, but deep down, I knew that the night nurse's room had something to do with her disappearance. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about Ank and her sudden disappearance. I had to find out more about the night nurse's room. The history of this room was a mystery, and I knew that the older nurses knew more than they were willing to admit. I spoke to one of the oldest nurses, Mrs. Weber, who had been working in the clinic for decades. She seemed hesitant, but after some prodding, she told me about the old legend associated with the room. It wasn't always a break room, she began. Years ago, it belonged to a night nurse named Ilse. She was young, bright, but at some point something changed. Ilse had been acting strangely in the last months of her life. She claimed to hear voices at night and spoke of dark figures haunting her. No one believed her, and soon she became paranoid. One night, Mrs. Weber whispered, she took her own life in that room. The coldness in her voice made the hairs on my neck stand up. After her death, the room was sealed, but employees repeatedly reported hearing knocking or whispering from the room at night. It was said that Ilse's spirit never truly left. She was still there, trapped between worlds, waiting for someone to set her free. The story made me shiver. Was it possible that Ank's disappearance was connected to Ilse's ghost? I knew I had to get to the bottom of it, but was I willing to take the risk? After hearing Mrs. Weber's story, I began to see the clinic through different eyes. Every time I passed the night nurse's room, I felt the coldness emanating from it. It was no longer just a room. It was a prison for Ilse's spirit, and I was sure she was trying to communicate with me. The whispers I had initially heard only near the room now began to come from the walls of the clinic. It was as if the entire clinic was permeated by an invisible force. The words were still incomprehensible, but they grew louder and clearer the closer I got to the room. The noises and the cold made it difficult for me to concentrate on my work. It was as if the darkness around me grew thicker the longer I stayed in the clinic. The whispering was now a constant companion, and it seemed as if Ilse was calling to me, but I knew I had to be careful. One night, when the whispering was particularly loud, I decided to enter the night nurse's room again. This time, I was determined to find out what was really going on. As I opened the door, the whispering stopped abruptly. The room lay in deep shadow, and the painting of Ilse on the wall seemed to stare at me with her empty eyes. I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me. The air was icy, and I could see my breath. Something in the room had changed. The cold was oppressive, and it felt as if something dark was lurking, waiting for me. The room was silent, yet I knew I wasn't alone. My gaze wandered, and in the corner of the room, I discovered an old cabinet that I hadn't noticed before. It was made of dark wood and looked as if it hadn't been opened for decades. Something about it sent a shiver down my spine. Hesitantly, I stepped closer and grasped the cold metal knob. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, and a musty smell rose towards me. Inside, old clothes hung, long decayed, but in the folds of a gown I discovered a yellowed piece of paper. It was a handwritten letter, its corners frayed. The writing was childish and hurried, as if the author had been in a great rush. The letter was from Ilse. She described her increasing despair, how she heard the voices and saw the shadows that were driving her to madness. At the end of the letter, it read, "They didn't let me go. I'm still here." My hands trembled as I read the letter. Ilse hadn't simply committed suicide. She had been forced to stay here. The spirit lurking in this room was still there, trapped in a kind of in-between world. And now I knew that I was not the first to encounter this terrible secret. After reading the letter, I noticed something I had overlooked before: the floor of the room. Everywhere there were deep scratch marks, stretching from the chair in the middle of the room all the way to the door. It looked as if someone had tried to desperately break free from the room. The scratch marks were old, but there were also fresh ones. My heart skipped a beat. Were those Ank's marks? Had she fought here before she disappeared? The thought that she might have been trapped in this room made my blood run cold. I couldn't get the image out of my head. As I continued to stare at the floor, I was suddenly overcome by the feeling of being watched. It was as if the night nurse was looking at me, waiting for my reaction. The cabinet, which had previously seemed so insignificant, now appeared like a dark threat. I knew that something in this room was lurking, waiting for me. The air grew colder, and I could see my own breath. It felt as if the darkness was closing in on me, as if it wanted to pull me into itself. But instead of fleeing, I knew I had to dig deeper. I had to uncover the secret of the night nurse's room, no matter how dangerous it was. In my desperation, I began to search the old archives of the clinic. Among the yellowed pages and tattered reports, I found a file documenting Ilse's last days. The notes were erratic, as if the person who wrote them had slowly lost their mind. But there was one entry that particularly interested me. Ilse had tried to fight the darkness in the clinic. She had performed a ritual in the hope of banishing the spirits of the deceased patients who haunted her, but the ritual had failed. "I opened the door," she wrote. "Now I can't close it anymore." The realization hit me like a blow. Had she conjured something far more powerful than she had expected? And now, it was my task to finish the ritual. I knew I had to perform the same ritual to calm the spirits and free the clinic from the darkness. I gathered the necessary utensils and prepared everything as described in the notes. I placed the candles in the room and drew the symbols on the floor. My hands trembled, but I knew I had no other choice. If I successfully performed the ritual, I might be able to find Ank and finally bring Ilse's spirit to rest. The candles flickered violently as the ritual began. The darkness in the room grew denser, almost palpable. It was as if the air itself grew heavier. The cold crept under my skin, and I felt an invisible force watching me, but I continued to speak the words as described in the notes. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and the room became eerily quiet. An oppressive feeling settled over me, and I felt the darkness around me intensify. It was as if the room itself was working against me. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, and for a moment I thought I was seeing something hold it back. Then I heard it, Ilse's soft, ominous whisper. Her voice was clearer than ever before, and she spoke directly to me. "You called me," she whispered, "but now you won't send me away again." The cold emanating from her was suffocating, and I felt the darkness threatening to consume me. But I spoke the last words of the ritual, and at that moment the room was filled with a blinding light. It was as if the darkness itself was torn apart. I felt Ilse's presence weaken and finally disappear completely. The cold receded, and the room slowly returned to normal. I sank exhausted to the floor. The ritual was over, but I knew it was only a temporary calm. The clinic was still a place of suffering, a place where spirits were trapped, but for the moment, I had brought back peace. After the ritual, the atmosphere in the clinic noticeably changed. The coldness that had previously been so omnipresent seemed to have subsided. It was as if a heavy veil had been lifted from the building. The corridors seemed less threatening, and the nocturnal noises that had haunted me for so long fell silent. But one thing gave me no peace: the painting of Ilse that had previously hung in the night nurse's room was gone. When I checked the next morning, the spot on the wall was empty. No one on the staff could explain where it had gone. It was as if the painting had never been there. The disappearance of the painting was a sign that Ilse had finally found peace, yet it also left an unease within me. Had she truly left, or had she merely passed into another dimension? The questions gnawed at me, but I knew I wouldn't get clear answers. The clinic gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The night nurse's room remained locked, and no one dared to enter it. But in my dreams, Ilse's image kept reappearing, her empty, cold smile haunting me, as if she wanted to thank me, but also as if she had never truly left me. The darkness might have been defeated, but I knew it would never completely disappear. It would always lurk in the corners, ready to reappear when the moment was right. Finally, I decided to leave the clinic. My time here was over, and I knew I could not stay any longer. The experiences I had had in the past few weeks had changed me. I felt as if I had left a part of my soul in this clinic. I said goodbye to the few colleagues who had grown dear to me in that short time. They seemed to sense that something special had happened, but no one spoke it aloud. The clinic would continue, as it always had, but I knew that the darkness would never completely disappear. As I left the grounds, I cast one last glance at the old building. The windows looked back empty and deserted, and I wondered how many more people would lose their minds here, trapped in the corridors of this clinic. The darkness might have been temporarily banished, but it still lurked in the shadows. In my dreams, I would always see the night nurse's room, the cabinet, the scratch marks on the floor, the painting of Ilse haunting me with her empty smile. I knew I would never truly be free of this place. Yet I hoped that I had at least found the peace I was looking for. The darkness in this clinic would never completely disappear, but I had done my part, and it was time to move on. Wherever Ilse was now, I hoped she had finally found rest, and that I could do the same. When I was admitted to the psychiatric clinic, I had the uncanny feeling that I was being brought to a prison, not a place of healing. The tall, cold walls of the building seemed to immediately enclose me, as if the place wanted to swallow me whole. Every corridor I walked through seemed endless, and the smell of disinfectant mingled with a damp, stale air that made it difficult to breathe. My family had insisted I would find help here, but as the heavy doors closed behind me, I instinctively knew this was no ordinary hospital. The eyes of the staff seemed empty, and their movements were mechanical, as if they had long internalized the misery of this place. The walls around me seemed to hide secrets, and I immediately felt uncomfortable. The room I was put in was particularly oppressive. There was no window, and the few pieces of furniture were old and dilapidated. The only light source was a dim ceiling lamp that barely illuminated the room. An uneasy feeling crept over me the first time I sat on the bed. It felt as if this room had a history I didn't yet understand, but which was waiting to reveal itself to me. From the very first night, I couldn't sleep. The darkness seemed to press into every corner as if it were alive. Several times I got up to make sure I was really alone, but the feeling of being watched kept returning. It was as if the walls of the room were lurking, as if they were tracking my every breath. I tried to calm myself, but something deep inside me knew that this was just the beginning. This room was different. It was more than just a simple space. It felt like a trap, one from which there might be no escape. After only a few nights, I noticed the strange noises that permeated the building. It was a faint scratching that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just the old building settling under the weight of time. But the scratching repeated itself again and again, regularly, like a sign I couldn't ignore. One night, the scratching was accompanied by a whisper. It wasn't a clear whisper, but rather a rustle that seemed to lurk in the shadows of the room. I couldn't understand the words, but the presence that accompanied them was unmistakable. It was as if something or someone was trying to get my attention, trying to call to me. The whispering had grown more and more intense, and I could no longer clearly distinguish between imagination and reality. I tried to talk to the staff about it, but they evaded my questions. "That's normal here," one of the nurses said, her eyes empty. "The building is old, it makes noises." But I felt that she knew more than she was saying. The noises soon became my constant companion. It was as if the darkness of the room was manifesting itself, trying to drive me to madness through the whispering and scratching. Every sound grew louder and more threatening. The nights were torture, and I found no more rest. It was clear that these noises were not just the result of an old building. They were a message, a warning, or perhaps a cry for help from another world that was drawing me deeper and deeper into the darkness of the room. One evening, when I could no longer bear the constant fear, I sat down next to Mr. Becker, an older patient who had been in the clinic for years. He was a quiet but strange figure, always with a knowing smile on his face, as if he harbored secrets that no one else knew. He looked at me as if he had been waiting for this conversation. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he asked softly without looking directly at me. I nodded, unsure how much I should reveal. "The walls here whisper," he continued, "but it's not the walls themselves, it's those who are trapped inside." His words made my heart beat faster. What did he mean? Were the noises I heard the voices of people trapped here? Mr. Becker told me that the room I lived in had once been a place where patients were kept in total isolation. "No window, no doors, only darkness," he whispered. "It wasn't meant for healing. It was for those no one wanted anymore. Some of them never left." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I asked him what had happened to those patients. "Sometimes," he said, "you can still hear them. They want out, but they can't." His gaze was fixed, and I knew he was speaking the truth. This place, this room, had left its mark, and now I was the next to experience its grim history. From that moment on, I knew that what I was hearing was real. It wasn't just noises, it was the remnants of souls trapped in the walls of the clinic, and I had to find a way to escape them before it was too late. The next few days were spent in a kind of constant panic. Mr. Becker's stories had confirmed my worst fears. I was trapped in a room that was itself a prison. The fact that there was no window made the situation even more oppressive. But one night, I discovered something that intensified my fear even further. I ran my fingers over the walls when I suddenly felt an unevenness. It was a kind of crack that had the shape of a window. My heart skipped a beat. Why had this window been bricked up? What was being hidden here? I pressed my hand against the spot and felt the cold coming from the wall. The next day, I confronted one of the nurses about it. Hesitantly, he admitted that there used to be a window in this room. "It was bricked up many years ago," he said, after an incident. He didn't want to elaborate, but the way he looked away told me that the history of this room was deeply hidden in the clinic's archives. I couldn't shake the thought that the absence of the window had an important meaning. Was it intentionally sealed to keep someone or something inside? The noises I heard every night now seemed even louder and more pressing, as if they were a response to my discovery. The knowledge of the window completely changed my view of the room. I was not just in an isolated room, I was trapped in a place created to preserve darkness, and that darkness was still here, watchful and hungry. In the nights after my discovery, it was impossible to think of sleep. The noises intensified, and I felt constantly watched. One particular night, however, would forever remain in my memory. I crept through the corridors of the clinic, hoping to find some peace, but what I found made my blood run cold. At the end of a long, dark corridor, I saw a figure standing. At first, I thought it was one of the nurses, but the closer I came, the less human the figure seemed. Its body was slender, almost like a child's, and its face was shrouded in deep shadows. I stopped, unable to move further, when suddenly a faint whisper emanated from the direction of the figure. "Come," I heard the voice say. It was so soft that I wasn't sure if I had really heard it, but the figure began to move slowly, and with each step it took, the darkness around it grew thicker. I was paralyzed, and my heart beat so loudly that I thought it would burst from my chest. The figure suddenly stopped, turned around, and vanished. It was as if it had dissolved into thin air. The corridor was empty again, but the cold presence it had left behind remained. I ran back to my room, but the darkness seemed to follow me, like an invisible hand reaching out for me. I told Mr. Becker about my encounter the next day, but he didn't seem surprised. "She is one of them," he said softly, "one of those trapped here forever." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I wasn't the only one wandering the corridors of this clinic. The next night was worse than all the previous ones. The feeling of being watched was so strong that I couldn't turn off the light, but despite the brightness of the lamp in my room, I suddenly noticed a shadow moving on the wall. It was dark, much darker than the shadows created by the lamp's dim light, and it seemed to be alive. I held my breath and watched as the shadow slowly glided across the wall. It moved in my direction, as if it was moving towards something, towards me. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. The shadow stopped at the foot of my bed and seemed to hesitate for a moment before slowly sinking into the floor and disappearing. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, but the hallway was silent. The shadow was gone, but the fear it had triggered in me remained. I couldn't believe what I had seen, but deep inside, I knew that this shadow was real. It was a part of the darkness that lived in this room and reached for me. The next morning, I told a nurse about the incident, but he dismissed it as imagination. "Those are just dreams," he said, "nothing more." But I knew it was more. The shadow was not just an illusion. It was the manifestation of the darkness that lurked in this room, reaching for me. From that moment on, I lived in constant fear. Every night, I expected the shadow to return, and I knew that eventually I had to find a way to escape it, or I would be consumed by it. One evening, as the tension became unbearable, I decided to explore an old wing of the clinic that had been locked for years. The door leading to this area was usually secured with a heavy lock, but on that day it stood open. Without hesitation, I stepped inside and began to wander through the dilapidated rooms. The wing was in a deplorable state. The walls were permeated with dampness, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. Dust covered everything, and it smelled of decay. It was as if this part of the clinic had been forgotten for decades, but something pulled me further, deeper into the dark corridors. In one of the rooms, I found an old cabinet, and to my surprise, there were still patient files stored there. Most were illegible, yellowed, and covered in mold, but one file caught my eye. It was the file of a patient who had once been housed in my room. I read the entries with growing horror. The patient had increasingly complained of voices coming from the walls and of shadows that haunted him. The last entry was particularly disturbing. Patient disappeared, room sealed. I felt sweat break out on me, and I knew I was living in a room that refused to let go of its darkness. I ran back to my room, but the walls seemed to close in around me. The darkness was real, and I knew I would soon have to confront it. But it seemed there was no escape. After my discovery in the old wing, the whispering in my room became unbearable. It was no longer just a soft rustle. It was everywhere and came from every corner of the room. I could no longer sleep, could no longer concentrate. The voice was female, and although I couldn't understand the words, I knew they were deep. One night, I was abruptly woken from my sleep as the whispering grew louder, seeming to override my thoughts. "Come to me." I heard the voice say, clearer than ever before. I wanted to scream, wanted to run out of the room, but something held me back. It was as if an invisible force held me in bed. I couldn't help myself. I got up, my feet moving as if on their own, and my gaze wandered to the cabinet in the corner of the room. The door was slightly open, and the whispering seemed to come directly from within. With trembling hands, I stepped closer and opened the door fully. Inside the cabinet sat a figure. It was small, like a child, but its face was shrouded in deep shadows. Only its eyes were visible, two glowing points that stared piercingly at me. "Come," the figure whispered again. I stumbled back, slammed the cabinet door shut, and ran to the door, but the whispering followed me into my dreams. The figure's eyes wouldn't leave me. I knew I couldn't stay in this room much longer, but where could I flee? The darkness was everywhere in the clinic. The next day, I spoke to Mr. Becker again. I told him about the figure in the cabinet, and he just nodded slowly. "She has come," he said softly. "It is time." I didn't understand what he meant until he described an old ritual that was supposedly meant to appease the spirits trapped in the clinic. "You must perform the ritual in your room," he said. "It is the only way to banish them." He gave me a tattered page with strange symbols and instructions. It was a dangerous ritual that had been used by the first patients of the clinic to banish the darkness, but many who had tried had failed. That night, I prepared everything. I drew the symbols on the floor of my room and lit the candles as instructed. The whispering was louder than ever before, and I felt the figure in the cabinet watching me. I began to murmur the words of the ritual, my voice trembling with fear. As I spoke the last words, the room around me began to vibrate. The darkness grew thicker, and I felt it threatening to crush me. The figure in the cabinet suddenly screamed, a piercing, earth-shattering scream that almost knocked me to the floor. The symbols on the floor lit up brightly, and the darkness seemed to retreat. The scream of the figure in the cabinet echoed in my head, and I was sure I had not successfully completed the ritual. The darkness was so thick that I could barely see anything, and the candles flickered violently in the wind that suddenly seemed to blow through the room. The figure in the cabinet was now clearly visible, and its face was contorted with rage. I knew I couldn't give up. The ritual was my only chance to escape this darkness. I spoke the words again, my voice trembling yet resolute. The figure in the cabinet writhed in the darkness, unable to get closer to me, but I knew it wouldn't let me go so easily. The air in the room grew heavier, and I felt the darkness closing in around my body. It was as if it wanted to pull me into itself, but I continued to focus on the symbols on the floor, which now glowed with a bright, almost blinding light. The darkness screamed again as if it were burning. Finally, I spoke the last words of the ritual, and suddenly everything was silent. The darkness retreated, and the figure in the cabinet was gone. The candles continued to burn steadily, and the room suddenly felt peaceful. I sank exhausted to the floor. The ritual had worked, but it had almost cost me my life. I knew that the darkness in the clinic was not defeated forever. It would return, perhaps in another form, perhaps in another room. But for the moment, I was safe. The figure in the cabinet was gone, and the whispering had stopped. In the morning, the clinic felt different. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere was gone, and the patients seemed calmer. Yet I knew that this peace would be short-lived. The darkness in this clinic was deeply rooted, and it would eventually reappear. I packed my few belongings and prepared to leave the clinic. I knew I could no longer stay here. The darkness had held me captive for too long, and although I had successfully completed the ritual, I felt that I would never truly be free of it. As I walked through the corridors to say goodbye to Mr. Becker, I still felt the presence of darkness in the walls. It hadn't completely disappeared, it was just waiting, but I was ready to leave this place behind. Mr. Becker looked at me as I shook his hand and simply said, "You survived, but she won't forget you." I left his room, but his words echoed in my head. Had I truly won, or had I merely escaped the darkness's first attack? I didn't know, but I was determined to start my life anew, far away from this cursed place. As I passed my room, I paused briefly. The door was open and the room was empty. It seemed brighter, but I knew this was just an illusion. The darkness was still there, lurking in the corners, ready to consume the next person who moved into that room. I left the clinic on a cloudy morning. The sky was gray, and a cold wind blew through the trees. I was glad to leave this place behind, but the shadows that had haunted me for the past few weeks wouldn't let me go. They had become a part of me, a part of my story. As I stepped through the clinic gate, I turned once more and looked at the old building. It stood still and eerie, as if waiting for the next patient to discover its dark secrets. I knew that the darkness had never truly been defeated, it had only been temporarily appeased. I walked away, but the memories of the figure in the cabinet, of the whispering and the shadows, wouldn't leave me. They would always stay with me, haunt my dreams, and remind me of what had happened in that room. I had survived it, but I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped. The darkness that lived in that room was a power that could not be fully understood. It was ancient, primeval, and it would always return. The clinic might be behind me now, but I knew that I would always be a part of it. I was free, but I knew I could never truly leave the darkness behind. It had become a part of me, and it would always wait to reclaim me.
Well,